And promises to take the unilateral action that's needed if necessary. Congress comes back to work facing serious pressure on guns and on dreamers. And the sheriff, who stood front and center during much of the Florida school shooting aftermath, is facing himself a major blowback for one critic calls dereliction of duty. This is Special Report. Good evening. Welcome to Washington. I'm Bret Baier. President Trump is promising to turn the nation's grief into action when it comes to guns. And he is continuing to champion the idea of arming teachers and faculty or some trained personnel inside schools. He says bump stocks are, quote, gone, no matter what Congress does. And the president wants to give law enforcement more latitude to take guns away from high-risk people. President Trump talked to the nation's governors today at the White House and said he would have gone into that school and gone after the Florida shooter, weapon or not. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts starts us off tonight from the North Lawn. Good evening, John.
Brett, good evening. President Trump says he wants to change some of the laws regarding gun ownership in the United States, but that when it comes to protecting the nation's schools, the president believes the cheapest and most effective way to do it is to fight fire with fire.
Thank you very much.
In his third major listening session, President Trump met with most of the nation's governors at the White House today, insisting the best way to deter school shootings is to let killers know they won't make it out alive.
The bad guy has to understand that there's a big price to pay when they mess around with our students. They have to know. They walk in, they're going to probably end up dead. And if they know they're going to end up dead, they're not going into that school.
But on his proposal to train and arm qualified members of school faculty and staff, President Trump got pushback from Washington's Democratic Governor Jay Inslee.
I've listened to the first grade teachers that don't want to be pistol packing first grade teachers. I've listened to law enforcement who have said they don't want to have to train teachers as law enforcement agencies, which takes about 6 months. I just suggest we need a little less tweeting here, a little more listening, and let's just take that off the table and move forward.
It's not just Democrats who oppose the idea. Florida's Republican Governor, Rick Scott, a staunch supporter of President Trump, says educators should educate. Protecting schools is a job he wants law enforcement to take on.
I'm not waiting for the federal government. We're going to invest $500 million. We're going to have a significant law enforcement presence at every public school in our state.
The White House today wouldn't weigh in on calls for Broward County Sheriff Scott Israel to either step down or be investigated. But President Trump again lashed out at Deputy Scott Peterson and possibly others for not rushing into the school to take on the shooter, saying he would have done it differently.
They weren't exactly Medal of Honor winners, all right? The way they performed was frankly disgusting. I really believe, you don't know until you test it, but I really believe I'd run in there even if I didn't have a weapon. And I think most of the people in this room would have done that too.
President Trump also promised that if Congress doesn't act soon to ban so-called bump stocks used by the shooter in the Las Vegas massacre, he'll do it himself. And while he hasn't mentioned raising the minimum age for buying a rifle for a few days, the president still supports the concept and says he is prepared to go toe-to-toe with the NRA over it.
Don't worry about the NRA. They're on our side. You guys, half of you are so afraid of the NRA. There's nothing to be afraid of. And you know what? If they're not with you, we fight them every once in a while. That's okay.
President Trump revealed today that he had lunch yesterday here at the White House with the leadership of the NRA, Wayne LaPierre, and Chris Cox. A spokesperson for the NRA told Fox News a few minutes ago that the leadership has not dropped its opposition to raising the minimum age to buy a rifle, nor will it. Brett?
Some breaking news, John, just confirmed about Hope Hicks.
Yeah, we learned just a little while ago, Brett, that another member of the president's inner circle, Hope Hicks, will be paying a visit to the House Intelligence Committee. She is the communications director here. Of course, she was his spokesperson and communications director all through the campaign. She'll be visiting the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence tomorrow morning. Brett?
Okay, John, thank you. More on that with Catherine Herridge a bit later. One of the survivors from the Florida massacre is crediting the love she felt from everyone around her for her recovery. 17-year-old Maddie Wilford spoke to reporters for the first time today.
I was sitting on my couch today just thinking about all the letters and gifts everyone has given and just like all the love that's been passed around. I definitely wouldn't be here without it, and I just want to send my appreciation and love out to all of you.
Rescuers initially thought Wilfred was dead. She suffered bullet wounds to her chest, abdomen, and arm. She's undergone 3 surgeries since the shooting. As John Roberts just mentioned, the man who became the face of the law enforcement response to the massacre is now himself facing intense scrutiny. Correspondent Phil Keating has the story of the Broward Sheriff tonight from Parkland. Good evening, Phil.
Good evening, Brett. Sheriff Scott Israel, the man who walked up to the cameras on evening number 1, declaring the horror for everyone that 17 lives had been taken at this school. Well, 2 times he has been elected as the Democratic candidate for sheriff, most recently reelected in 2016 with 72% of the vote. He calls these demands for his ouster purely political at a time when the tears still have not yet stopped.
I could only take responsibility for what I knew about. I've given amazing leadership.
Broward County, Florida Sheriff Scott Israel suddenly on the defensive for the job he's doing as sheriff of Florida's 2nd most populous county. More than 70 state lawmakers, all Republican, have called on Republican Governor Rick Scott to suspend Israel, who was elected as a Democrat, for incompetence and neglect of duty less than 2 weeks since 19-year-old former student Nicholas Cruz confessed to killing 17 people inside Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. Sheriff Israel acknowledged his deputies were called out nearly 24 times to deal with a volatile and gun-obsessed Cruz, but never took it further. The governor has now ordered the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to investigate.
The local sheriff's department, they've got to be completely transparent. We have to do a thorough investigation, and whoever didn't do their job has to be held accountable.
The National Rifle Association spokesperson faults the man at the top for not using his authority to arrest Cruz, adding,
And I wish that as much attention were given to the Broward County Sheriff and their abdication of duty as trying to blame 5 million innocent law-abiding gun owners all across the country.
Just Thursday, the sheriff shocked the community further when he said his armed deputy assigned to guard the high school failed to enter the freshman building as the bullets were flying.
At this point, 1 deputy was remiss, dereliction of duty, and he's now no longer with this agency.
That resource officer's attorney pushed back today, saying Scott Peterson was not a coward and evidence will exonerate his actions. Amid reports that upon arriving on scene, 3 other deputies also took up positions behind cars instead of rushing into the school, the sheriff says he is looking into that. But Sunday, Sheriff Israel said he will absolutely not resign.
You don't measure a person's leadership by a deputy not going in.
And more on that resource officer via his attorney. He says the reason he did not storm Building 12 on the day of the shooting was that at that moment, he thought the gunshots were coming from outside the building. Tomorrow's another day of planning here in the classrooms for the teachers. Then Wednesday, the more than 3,000 students return to their classrooms where they'll have to, in the morning, walk past all of the memorials, the media, and that freshman building still boarded up and a crime scene. Brett?
That's tough. Phil Keating, live in Parkland. Phil, thanks. The pressure is on Congress to do something about guns and school safety after its 10-day vacation. One of the first options, tougher background checks. But the calendar, as always, is chock full in Congress. Chief Congressional Correspondent Mike Emanuel fills us in from Capitol Hill tonight.
President Trump says he wants action on gun control.
The president is planning a meeting for Wednesday with bipartisan members of Congress.
Now much of the focus has shifted to a Senate measure from Texas Republican John Cornyn and Connecticut Democrat Chris Murphy to tighten up the criminal background check system. It would keep those with serious criminal records or severe mental illness from buying firearms. House Republican leaders are signaling they want to see what the Senate is capable of passing first, but predict Congress will act.
I believe so. We've already taken some action last year, but I think you're going to look more and you're going to see more legislation.
The background checks measure, which passed the House late last year, was attached to a concealed carry provision. New Jersey Republican Congressman Leonard Lance has written Speaker Paul Ryan asking him to bring up just the background check aspect. Today, the House Majority Whip, a victim of gun violence, focused more on mistakes made leading up to the Parkland attack.
Why did those breakdowns occur? And then let's focus more on addressing these problems in mental health that we've started to deal with in Congress. Let's close loopholes. Let's figure out what went wrong with government before people start talking about taking away the rights of law-abiding citizens.
There's also a looming deadline 1 week from today affecting the so-called Dreamers.
As of that date, absent some court decision, continuing court protection, 1,000 of these young people a day will be subject to deportation, will be unable to continue to legally work in America. They include 900 of them who have volunteered to serve in our military.
Today, after the Supreme Court rejected the Trump administration's request to immediately decide whether ending DACA could be enforced, President Trump noted the program is working its way through the courts and made a broader point to the nation's governors.
So we have to get immigration laws that allow us to do what we have to be able to do. They are so soft. No country in the world has immigration laws so soft like we do.
Lawmakers are also expected to work on an omnibus major spending bill facing a March 23rd deadline.
That means Congress has 4 weeks to work out a major bill to fund the government through the end of the fiscal year. And this is expected to be a very short week, with the Reverend Billy Graham due to lie in honor in the Capitol Rotunda on Wednesday and Thursday. Brett?
Mike Emanuel, live in Capitol Hill. Mike, thanks. Former President George W. Bush paid his respects today to the late Reverend Billy Graham. The president and his wife Laura visited Graham's childhood home in North Carolina to view his casket. Thousands of people turned out today at the public viewing. Billy Graham died last week at the age of 99. Long-serving California Senator Dianne Feinstein has failed to win the official endorsement of California Democrats for re-election to a fifth full term. State Senate leader Kevin De Leon received 54% support at this weekend's state convention. Feinstein had just 37%. But since neither hit the 60% threshold, neither will receive the party's seal of approval or extra campaign cash heading into the June Democratic primary in California. Wall Street is working hard to regain more of the ground lost earlier this month, and today was a big day on the markets. The Dow was up well over 400 points before finishing ahead 399. The S&P 500 gained 32. The Nasdaq got back 84 today. Let's get some analysis of what happened today and what's going on. Deirdre Bolton of the Fox Business Network joins us from New York. Good evening, Deirdre.
Good evening, Brett. Today's gains, along with Thursdays and Fridays, all about getting back to the levels that we saw before that brutal 2-week sell-off earlier this month. So after those losses, markets were in a correction, which means they had fallen 10% off their most recent highs. So as of today, stocks are more than halfway back to correcting those big losses. Now, if you look at tech shares, they're already back to pre-correction levels. And some of the standouts today, Facebook, Apple, Netflix, Google, parent Alphabet. But Amazon, take a note of this. It rose 1.5%, but it made the world's richest man even richer. So founder and CEO Jeff Bezos made $1.7 billion today alone. He is now worth more than $120 billion. Along with tech, financials also contributed to the gains. So strategists say there are two main reasons for investor optimism. Corporate America producing strong earnings. This reporting period has been one of the best since 2011. Strategists also saying investors are getting used to the idea of higher interest rates. The yield on the 10-year Treasury note stabilized under a key psychological level of 3%. That level was moving higher earlier this month. It made investors nervous since higher rates make all borrowing more expensive. Brett, back to you.
All right, we'll see what happens tomorrow. Deirdre, thank you. U.S. Supreme Court justices are tonight considering a major case that could affect union workers nationwide. Fox News at Night anchor Shannon Bream has specifics.
The fundamental issue is my right to choice.
Illinois public employee Mark Janis says from the time a union fee was deducted from his first paycheck, he's never had the right to say either yes or no to having the union represent him. And while he says he's not against unions, he is opposed to being forced to underwrite their political speech. During arguments at the Supreme Court Monday, Justice Kennedy put it this way, quote, "What we're talking about here is compelled justification and compelled subsidization of a private party that expresses political views constantly." For decades, the High Court has debated how best to handle union fees for workers who do benefit from the organization's collective bargaining efforts, but who do not want to lend any support to their political activities. Justice Sotomayor suggested today that it's sometimes part of the bargain. Quote, "We've compelled people to pay bar associations. Bar members can come out any day they want and say they don't take the same position on a policy question as the bar association. Any union member is free to get up publicly in any setting he or she wants to say they don't agree with the position the union is taking." As for the potential impact on millions of unionized government employees, both sides admitted membership would likely drop if the union loses this case, with Chief Justice John Roberts noting unions would likely have to work harder to make their case to employees. It's a heated issue now pitting the state's governor and attorney general on opposite sides.
When a government union boss can give campaign cash to get a politician elected and then sit across the table from them after they're elected and negotiate terms, that's a conflict. It's in fact a bribe.
This case is not about impinging on anybody's First Amendment rights. The law already protects people's First Amendment rights. This is a case where there are a small group of very well-funded right-wing extremists that want to eliminate unions throughout this country.
8 of the 9 justices have voted on similar cases within recent years. We know how they voted, splitting evenly 4-4. So there's an enormous focus on the newest member on the bench, Justice Neil Gorsuch. Normally very chatty and engaged in the arguments, but today he did not say a word. So we're going to have to wait until the ruling is due by June.
Quickly, Mike mentioned the DACA situation. Basically, they just want this thing to be ironed out in the lower courts to come forward.
Yeah, there was no ruling on the merits today. It's not as if the Supreme Court ruled one way or the other about whether the program is good or not, legal or not. They're saying they want some of this lower court stuff to play out before they get involved.
All right, Shannon, as always, thank you. See you at 11 p.m. Eastern. Up next, the latest on the Trump dossier and whether it was improperly used to get surveillance on the Trump campaign. First, here's what some of our Fox affiliates around the country are covering tonight. Fox 11 in West Virginia, as a teachers' strike keeps public schools closed for a third day. The State Department of Education's website shows all school districts closed in all 55 counties as teachers press for pay raises amid higher health care costs. West Virginia, by the way, the teacher pay ranks 48th in the nation. Fox 16 in Little Rock with aerial images of damage from what the National Weather Service says were 2 tornadoes that hit northeast Arkansas over the weekend. One man was killed when his trailer home was blown into a pond. The 2 tornadoes were packing maximum winds of 115 and 90 miles per hour. And this is a live look at New York. Wow, Sunset, New York from Fox 5. One of the big stories there tonight, commemoration of the 25th anniversary of the bombing of the World Trade Center. 6 people were killed, including a pregnant woman, in a blast that injured more than 1,000 and forced tens of thousands to flee those buildings. It happened 8 years before the Twin Towers came down during the 9/11 attacks. That is tonight's live look outside the Beltway from Special Report. We'll be right back.
6-3.
Republicans on the House Intelligence Committee are taking the next step in trying to prove that the Democrat-funded Trump dossier was wrongly used as justification for much of the investigation into alleged collusion with the Russians. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge shows us the latest tactic.
Current and former government officials, including former FBI Director James Comey, former CIA Director John Brennan, and former Intelligence Chief James Clapper, have until Friday to tell the House Intelligence Committee when they knew the Trump dossier was funded by the DNC and Clinton campaign. Subpoenas are in play.
If they don't answer those 10 questions truthfully and fully, then yes.
Responding to Republican allegations earlier this month that the FBI and Justice Department were guilty of surveillance abuses during the 2016 campaign, the Democrats' counter memo was released over the weekend with redactions at the FBI's request. Democrats conclude there was intelligence beyond the Trump dossier to justify surveillance of a campaign aide.
The FBI acted appropriately in seeking a warrant on Carter Page. They're not part of some deep state, as the president apparently would like the public to believe.
The Democrats said multiple sources, which are redacted, corroborate dossier allegations, but this appears to conflict with former FBI Director James Comey's 2017 congressional testimony. 3 months after the Page surveillance warrant in October 2016, Comey briefed the incoming president at Trump Tower and still considered the dossier salacious and unverified. The Democrats also emphasized the FISA court knew the dossier was a political document, but specifics about who funded the project were properly withheld because of the FBI's long-standing tradition to protect sources.
The bottom line with the court is this, that we can't have a secret court operate like this in America where they're going to take and use it against political enemies.
The Republican memo said former FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe testified that the Bureau would never have sought the Pace surveillance warrant without the dossier. The Democrats do not directly challenge the finding, and it gets only a passing reference in the press release fact sheet. Brett?
Captain, thank you. Let's get some perspective on all of this. Senior political analyst Britt Hume joins us again tonight. Good evening, Britt. Your thoughts on the Democrat memo, all the fallout from it this weekend?
Well, I've read both these memos carefully, and the Republican memo basically asserts that the FBI and Justice Department made improper use of this so-called dossier, which was a collection of, to some extent unverified, to a considerable extent unverified material, a lot of it salacious, as you heard Catherine report quoting Comey, in acquiring a warrant to spy on a man, Carter Page, who had been advising the Trump campaign. And they alleged two things, the Republicans did. One was that they made heavy use of this dossier, which was an improper basis for a warrant. And secondly, that they failed to inform the court of the extent to which this was a partisan document basically paid for by the Democratic Party and the Clinton campaign. The Democratic memo attempts to rebut that, but it doesn't really do that. It says, for example, that there was a lot of other solid material used as the basis for this warrant. But if that were true, then why bring the dossier into it at all if they had plenty of other basis for the warrant? And the second thing that the Democrats argue, of course, is that the court was properly informed of the extent to which this was a partisan document. Well, I have read the quote in the Democrats' memo, and it is a masterpiece of circumlocution, ending up being only the vaguest attribution of this document to politics, and it certainly doesn't tell the judge that this was something paid for by the Clinton campaign and the Democratic Party. So those are kind of the central allegations that we're dealing with here, and I don't think they're sufficiently or effectively rebutted by the Democratic memo.
Yeah, I saw some of your comments over the weekend on Twitter about it. Andrew McCarthy had a pretty detailed piece, point by point, about some of this in National Review. One of the things that's interesting is to listen to the Democrats, Britt, who had a real problem prior to the Nunes GOP memo coming out, warning about a threat to national security. And yet this memo is redacted in parts pretty heavily because sources and methods are in this memo.
That's right. There was the Democrats. Remember this, Brett, going back to the time when the Republican memo was first about to emerge, and the Democrats had womped up their memo after the Republicans had written theirs as a rebuttal. And the Democrats on that committee were prepared to have both memos unchanged, released right away. And that didn't happen. The Republican memo was put through a process. The Democratic memo went through the same process later. The Republican memo was found to have very little, if anything, in it that revealed sources and methods, and we saw when it came out that there were no redactions. The Democratic memo comes along that the Democrats were prepared to release without any further review, and it's absolutely laced with redactions made at the suggestion of the FBI and the Justice Department and the intelligence community to protect sources and methods. So it's a peculiar thing for the Democrats to have been charging all along when they produced this memo that appears to have had an array of disclosures of classified information relating to sources and methods.
Interesting. We'll see where it all goes. Britt, as always, thank you.
You bet, Brett.
The mayor of one California city is encouraging suspects to resist arrest.
Search for greatness. Indeed, the world's #1 job site.
The issue of illegal immigration continues to drive a wedge between the Trump administration and the state of California. Today, it concerns rumors of a major crackdown in one community. Chief Correspondent Jonathan Hunt is watching the story from Los Angeles tonight.
Oakland Mayor Libby Schaaf says she warned residents of impending raids so they could prepare, not panic. And she reiterated her city's determination to resist the Trump administration's crackdown on illegal immigration.
It is our legal right to not expend our precious law enforcement resources on assisting the federal government in enforcing what is a civil federal matter.
And she encouraged any targeted illegal immigrants to resist arrest efforts by immigration and customs enforcement agents.
Residents should know that they do not have an obligation to open their doors if an ICE official knocks.
And while video has been posted on social media of at least one arrest in the Bay Area and several other arrests reported, officials with ICE say simply that they conduct operations every day. In a statement, spokesman James Schwab criticized sanctuary cities like Oakland, saying they are not immune from federal law and that forcing ICE to assign additional resources to conduct arrests in the community puts the safety of officers and the public at greater risk. As the Trump administration's feud with California over immigration builds, its relationship with Mexico continues to deteriorate. According to the Washington Post, Mexico's president, Enrique Peña Nieto, canceled his tentative White House visit after President Trump rejected Nieto's request to publicly affirm Mexico's position of refusing to pay for the proposed border wall. It's unclear what, if any, effect this disagreement will have on the two administrations' negotiations on other issues, including the North American Free Trade Agreement. Brett?
Jonathan, thank you. President Trump says North Korea wants to talk, and the U.S. will, but only under the right conditions. A North Korean envoy sent a message through South Korea Sunday saying the North has ample intentions of holding talks with the U.S. The Trump administration insists North Korea must give up its nuclear and missile programs first. Kim Jong-un is insisting he will not do that. Syria, meantime, is sending ground forces into a Damascus suburb in the latest move to put down opposition forces. This comes despite demands from the international community to stop targeting the civilians there. Correspondent Connor Powell has an update from our Middle East newsroom.
Another airstrike, another body pulled from its aftermath. The bombs continue to fall in eastern Ghouta, just as they did before the UN Security Council voted on Saturday to demand a 30-day ceasefire. Syrian and Russian jets have pounded the rebel-held enclave for weeks, killing more than 500 people. There is no time to catch one's breath. The blood is flowing, this doctor says, and the hospitals are overflowing. Opposition groups claim the Assad regime has once again used chlorine gas on civilians. One child died while 18 others were treated with symptoms consistent with chlorine exposure. The White House said it is following the situation in Syria, but refused to say what action it might take.
I think that the president put the Assad regime on notice some time ago, and we're continuing to echo that message. When I said that we call for an immediate end to these offensive operations, we mean it.
Damascus denies the allegation, while Russia's foreign minister said the claim was an attempt by opposition groups to sabotage the ceasefire. All this comes as Russia says the UN-backed truce would only take effect when all sides agree on how to enforce it, including when rebels halt shelling Damascus.
We will be discussing it further with Americans and their allies, which are part of the coalition. They need to explain to us why these actions continue.
But Russian President Vladimir Putin, flexing his muscles today, did agree to a 5-hour pause in the bombing tomorrow to allow civilians to leave the area. The Trump administration has said Russia bears responsibility for what happens in Syria. But unlike last spring's chemical attack, where the U.S. launched 59 Tomahawk missiles at the Assad regime in retaliation, what the U.S. does this time is uncertain. Brett?
Connor Powell in our Middle East newsroom. Connor, thank you. Up next, the panel on the gun control debate, what could happen on Capitol Hill, and continuing questions about the law enforcement response to the Florida school massacre. First, beyond our borders tonight, 5 people have died from injuries received in an explosion that caused the collapse of a building in central England. The cause has not yet been established, but police do not believe it was terrorism. It happened in Leicester, about 110 miles north of London. The Communist Party is pushing a constitutional amendment that would grant Chinese President Xi Jinping the opportunity to rule indefinitely. China currently limits the president to 2 5-year considered to be all but certain to pass this measure. Leaders of the major Christian sects in Jerusalem closed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre for several hours Sunday to protest an Israeli plan to tax their properties. The church is built on the traditional site of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. The Christians are angry about the Jerusalem municipality plans to tax their various assets around the city. The city says non-church properties such as hotels and businesses cannot be exempt from taxes simply because they are owned by churches. So some of the other stories beyond our borders tonight. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Barry Sloan with NewTek, your business solutions company.
We'll turn our grief into action. We have to have action. This includes allowing well-trained and certified school personnel to carry concealed firearms. Bump stocks, we're writing that out. I'm writing that out myself. I don't care if Congress does it or not. I'm writing it out myself. Don't worry about the NRA. They're on our side. You guys, half of you are so afraid of the NRA. There's nothing to be afraid of. We must pursue common sense measures that protect the constitutional rights of law-abiding Americans while keeping guns out of the hands of those who pose a threat to themselves and to others. And we're going to have to start talking about mental institutions because a lot of the folks in this room closed their mental institutions.
President Trump talking with about 35 governors at the White House today. A big give and take lasted some time in front of the cameras, as you can hear, about school safety and guns. This as new polls out from USA Today and Suffolk, the most recent, saying should schools be required to have metal detectors at point of entry. There you see 62-27. Armed police officer on site, and there you see that, 58%. When it comes to curbing mass shootings, which is more important? You see the breakdown, restricting access to guns, improving mental health care, both. A lot of talking about different possible solutions on school safety. Let's bring in our panel. Steve Hayes, editor-in-chief for the Weekly Standard. Molly Hemingway, senior editor at The Federalist. And Dan Balls, national political correspondent at The Washington Post. Dan, let me start with you. You know, Congress is saying they're going to put some kind of legislative package in. When you hear the president talking about, of all things, the NRA, and you shouldn't be worried about it, do you think that there is a chance that some might come together?
I think it's still going to be difficult. I think they're still miles apart on some of these issues. I think it will be partly determined by how much people try to do. If they can go leaner and simpler, maybe they can do something on background checks, but beyond that, I don't know what they're going to be able to do. These standoffs have existed for a long time. The NRA has been very successful in blocking efforts in the past after other shootings. I think a lot of it will have to do with what role the president chooses to play and how effective he is.
Apparently he had lunch at the White House with some NRA leadership, including Wayne LaPierre and others. Molly.
I think it's kind of interesting that we're even talking about gun control as a response. The idea that we would respond to this story of epic government failure by restricting law-abiding Americans' right to keep and bear arms, something protected in the Second Amendment, is very confusing to a lot of people, and particularly with the details of this particular case.
You heard Governor Scott and the president talking about this sheriff's deputy, a couple of them outside the school, and also about the warnings that were missed. As Molly mentioned, take a listen.
The local sheriff's department, they've got to be completely transparent. We have to do a thorough investigation, and whoever didn't do their job has to be held accountable.
I got to watch some deputy sheriffs performing this weekend. They weren't exactly Medal of Honor winners.
I could only take responsibility for what I knew about. I exercised my due diligence. I've given amazing leadership to this agency. And, of course, I won't resign.
There are calls now, including the Florida House Speaker, for the Broward County Sheriff to resign. What about this, Steve?
Well, he has not, in fact, given amazing leadership. I would say he's been pretty much the opposite of what you'd expect of a leader in a time of crisis, responding to some of the things that Molly raised. I mean, there were failures again and again and again, not just in the last few minutes, not just in the heat of the moment, but going back months. There were failures, and I think his department is responsible for them. One of the reasons that we're talking about gun control in the aftermath of this is because President Trump is talking about gun control in the aftermath of this, and I think Dan is exactly right. A lot of what happens from this point forward will depend on how much President Trump wants to expend political capital to make something happen. Now, he said that he was working on bump stocks. He doesn't care if they do it legislatively. He's happy to do it administratively. There are two other places where he talked about making some changes. Background checks is the first one, and the age to purchase on long guns is the second. The White House seemed to, in Sarah Sanders' press briefing today, take a small step back from that, saying, you know, the president, while he may have said this is still being discussed. It's part of a broader discussion on this. Does that mean the White House is actually stepping back from these proposals that the president offered, or are they just actually making a tactical play to include it in a broader set of negotiations?
A number of governors stepped up, said that a couple of them said that they didn't feel comfortable with the teachers being armed, including Washington's governor, Inslee.
Now, I know that you have suggested arming our teachers. And
not your teachers. Arming a small portion that are very gun adept, that truly know how to handle. So it would just be a very small group of people that are very gun adept.
I've listened to the first grade teachers that don't want to be pistol packing first grade teachers. I've listened to law enforcement who have said they don't want to have to train teachers as law enforcement agencies, which takes about 6 months. So I just suggest we need a little less tweeting here, a little more listening.
Dan, what about this? I mean, is it gaining traction or taking away?
Fred, I think it's going to be a state-by-state thing. There are a number of governors. I was covering the governors all weekend, and in talking to them, there are a number of governors in both parties who are uncomfortable with this idea.
But we should point out some of them are already doing it.
But
Texas
some are already
and
doing it. And we talked with Governor Abbott in Texas about what they have done, and I think they said almost a fifth of the schools there have people who are armed. This is something that in part will have to do with the culture of each of those states, the culture of the use of guns and how comfortable people are with it. But there are a number of governors who say, including Republican governors, adding guns to this environment is not what they want to see in schools. But we'll see how this debate goes forward state by state.
Yeah, speaking of culture, I want to play one more soundbite. This is from Kentucky's governor.
We have to talk about the culture in this society. And when we mock and ridicule the very foundational principles that this nation was built upon, where you treat people the way you'd want to be treated, where you respect human life, where you respect the dignity of women and of children and of people who we have increasingly degraded in our society. This culture of death is becoming pervasive.
Hard to legislate something like that, but he was talking about using the bully pulpits in all of these states.
It's hard to legislate, but it's so important. It's something that all Americans can do, is think about how they are handling their own families, what they're doing to look out for their own family members, helping out people in their community who have greater needs, whether they be mental health or otherwise. It's not an easy fix. It's not going to get headlines, but it's actually what this country needs.
We'll be talking about this for a while. Next up, the U.S. Supreme Court says no, not yet, to President Trump over the Dreamers. So what about the March 5th deadline? We'll get into that.
DACA is going to be put back into the Ninth Circuit. You know, we tried to get it moved quickly because we'd like to help DACA. I think everybody in this room wants to help with DACA. But the Supreme Court just ruled that it has to go through the normal channels, so it's going back in. And there won't be any surprise.
As of that date, absent some court decision, continuing court protection, 1,000 of these young people a day will be subject to deportation, will be unable to continue to legally work in America.
I whipped the bill just a week and a half ago, so we know where we need to go to get a lot of the votes that we don't have to pass the bill. So we're working on that hard.
Well, the U.S. Supreme Court is essentially saying that this DACA case has to make its way through the courts before it takes it up. It's not taking it up now. This, as this March 5th deadline looms, the White House saying this, releasing a statement, the district judge's decision to unilaterally reimpose a program that Congress had explicitly and repeatedly rejected is a usurpation of legislative authority. The fact that this occurs at a time when elected representatives in Congress are actively debating this policy only underscores that the district judge has unwisely intervened in the legislative process. We look forward to having this case expeditiously heard by the appeals court and, if necessary, the Supreme Court, where we fully expect to prevail. Okay, back with the panel. Steve, what does this mean in the big picture for these DACA kids? I mean, are they breathing a sigh of relief? Are they saying, what are they saying?
I mean, I think they're breathing a short-term sigh of relief, but I don't think that this makes it the long-term prospects for any kind of lasting solution even greater. I mean, you have Paul Ryan and his team, Steve Scalise, just in the clip you just played, saying that they're working towards a solution. The president talking about wanting to get to a solution, but it's unclear what that solution is. I mean, you have new proposals being floated. Jeff Flake floated one last week that don't seem to satisfy all of the different people in the debate. This is one of those areas where I think the president can move the debate quite a bit by coming out and declaring clearly what he wants, what his final negotiation will be, but that might not be enough, particularly in the Senate.
I mean, the House is moving this Goodlatte-McCall bill, but that is actually more conservative than what failed in the Senate, so there's no chance that's getting
right. And the big challenge remains the need for 60 votes in the Senate. In a way, not having the deadline might be the worst news for DACA recipients, because it's that pressure that enables people to actually come to the table and start bargaining. The idea that you're going to fix this issue without fixing the underlying issues that led to the problem of having so many people in the country illegally over a long time is, you know, it might be what you expect from Congress, but it's not a good solution.
Dan?
Well, I think that the Democrats came out of the earlier negotiations with a feeling that the president would prefer to have the issue of the wall as a political issue rather than negotiate it. The White House came out of those negotiations believing that Democrats were not serious about really wanting to resolve this problem. So until you kind of get past that level of distrust that was created through the last round of negotiations, I think we're on hold. The idea that there is real activity heading towards something, I think, is, you know, as Steve said, this is not likely at this point. So it's going to take the ending of the Supreme Court doing something that opens this back up to force action in Congress, if they can do it then.
But does the deadline then just kind of filter away? Is it March 5th just come and go?
Well, in some ways it does, but for some DACA, for some dreamers, it creates a level of uncertainty, and as they lose their status and have to apply for renewal, they are potentially in jeopardy in that period because they won't have the protection. So there's going to be nervousness on the part of the dreamers, but the political will is not there at this point to resume those negotiations and get things done.
And the whole reason that the Trump administration rescinded DACA in the first place was because they were not prepared to lose a legal battle that was going to be waged by the states, who had found a very similar provision for the parents to be unconstitutional. So either way, this is an issue that's going to have to be dealt with one way or the other.
Speaking of battles with states, the Trump administration and the state of California on the sanctuary issue. Take a listen.
We will continue to dispel the ugly myth that many are perpetuating about our immigrant community. Residents should know that they do not have an obligation to open their doors if an ICE official knocks.
The whole concept of having a sanctuary state in California, that you're going to pick and choose what law you're going to uphold, goes against everything that makes us the United States of America. It goes against the core of who we are. That's why it's so disturbing of what they're doing.
I mean, the Oakland mayor is essentially saying, don't open your door. You don't have to. And if we find out about raids, we're going to tell you ahead of time.
Yeah, but it's pretty, on the one hand, it's not surprising. I mean, this has been going on at some level for years. But it is still shocking to hear her say that, to actually be giving direct advice to people who are here illegally about how they can avoid being taken in. Look, again, there's no easy solution on this either. I mean, you're seeing members of the people in California, you're seeing mayors throughout the country talking about how they can help illegal immigrants avoid deportation, withholding the efforts of local law enforcement. That's a huge problem.
And whether they withhold the funding, too, for those cities is really a big question. Panel, thank you. When we come back, Washington is not known for being
mistaken for gun, math symbol has students calling police. Amid increased concern over school safety and guns in the wake of last week's deadly mass shooting in Parkland, Florida, one student at Oberlin High School in Louisiana was reportedly subjected to an intrusive encounter with police over a comment about his math assignment. As the Miami Herald reported, Allen Parish authorities received a complaint about the student on February 20, just days after 17 students and staff were killed when a gunman opened fire at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. According to the complainant, the student allegedly made a terroristic threat related to the appearance of the square root symbol. Several students were reportedly involved in a conversation about its perceived resemblance to a firearm when one of them made a comment that apparently made someone feel uncomfortable. When detectives were advised of the complaint, they reportedly searched the student's home before soon determining that he posed no danger. The Allen Parish Sheriff's Office released a statement asserting that the student used extremely poor judgment in making the comment, but in light of the actual circumstances, there was clearly no evidence to support criminal charges. Authorities concluded the student did not have any intent to act violently, nor did he have access to guns. It was unclear from initial reports whether the student would face any formal disciplinary action, though police confirmed they had forwarded a complaint to the school board. Multiple students allegedly said the math symbol looked like a gun, but reports did not reveal the precise comment responsible for the complaint. Authorities confirmed the remark could have been interpreted out of context as a threat, according to CAC. While the proactive move by the agencies involved elicited praise from some on social media, many others thought it represented an example of overreaction by police. Reports did not specify whether the search was in accordance with the warrant or by permission of the homeowners, which several commenters saw as a central piece of the story. Though some argue police went too far in searching the student's home, the news came as suspicion rose in Florida that authorities dropped the ball in response to complaints about Nikolai Cruz, the suspected gunman behind last week's massacre. The FBI was reportedly also alerted to concerns about the suspect, including violent comments posted online by an account with a handle identical to his name. As a result of the criticism, Florida Governor Rick Scott has called on FBI Director Christopher Wray to resign. What do you think? Scroll down to comment below.